Hi guys! Today I am going to attempt making a video in English for you guys. I just want to say before anything, I have talked about so many things in English. I have been doing videos in English for years, and sometimes it's harder for me to make videos in English rather than in French because I have talked about those topics before, or because since I am a French citizen living in France, sometimes I react to what's happening in France, to French politics and to French society, I suppose you could say. And it's harder for me to kind of react to what's happening in the States or in Australia or in the United Kingdom, for example, or Ireland or Scotland or wherever, any English speaking country. I obviously react to what's happening worldwide, and it's always a pleasure to make videos in English, but sometimes it's a bit more difficult, and I am in a transition phase. I'm in like a change at the moment, like a period of change with new work, new place, and a lot of things to adapt to. So it is easier for me to make videos in French because it's easier for me to cover a topic that's already been covered in English, But today I wanted to talk about reverse racism. So I have filmed a video this morning in French about what we call in France racism towards white people, or racism anti-white people. And I have made a video about that in French a while back, but I thought the video was a bit incomplete and not precise at some moments. So I wanted to go back and answer some comments that usually come up, whatever, whenever you say that reverse racism is not a thing. So I'm trying to do this in English right now, and I'm gonna try to make it shorter with as much and as many informations, but just be more concise. So when I say that reverse racism doesn't exist, I often get 3 or 4 main arguments that come back very frequently. First one is South Africa. Second one is something that's more relevant to French society, so let me know if that's a thing in your country. We have suburbs, and we have those big buildings that are not really safe, that are not really pleasant to live in, where we have a concentration, like most of the population there is people of color. And there is actually, yes, a minority of white people there. And so people tell me that if you're white and you live in those suburbs, like I suppose if you were to, I would say maybe like in New York, you have those black or those Latino neighborhoods maybe. And oftentimes they are less privileged and less rich, and they're poorer basically and less safe, more dangerous than the white neighborhoods. And of course, if you're a white person living there, you're going to be a minority, and so I get often told that being white in those types of neighborhoods is actually scary and dangerous, and you get called dirty names based on the fact that you're white. The third thing I often hear is that racism, no matter who it is directed towards, is racism, and that you can hate any ethnicity or any race, and therefore you can hate white people, and therefore there is reverse racism. So I am going to try to answer those points really quickly with as much details as I can, so as many details as I can. And I'm tired, it's the end of the day, so I'm sorry if my English sucks, which is probably the case. Okay, so first one is just making sure that we all understand that when you say that reverse racism is not a thing, it's not about denying that some white people suffer some insults or hatred or attacks or any kind of violence, be it verbal or physical, based on the fact that they're white. We do not say that you cannot meet someone who is, Asian or Indian or South American or Latino or African or Arabic or from Northern Africa that that hates white people. It happens, that's true. Some people don't like white people. But while we do not say that those things don't exist, while we do not say that those cases, those situations don't exist, while we do not say that there hasn't been a time in history when a white woman or a white man was assaulted by people of color and that there were maybe some insults targeting his whiteness. While we don't say that those things don't happen, we say that this is not a racism as we think of racism. So I think the main issue is that there are actually two uses and two ideas or conceptions of the word racism. If you open the dictionary, a very basic dictionary, what you're gonna get is something along the lines of any hatred or attacks or violence repeated against a certain group of people. So when you take this definition, quite frankly, it's easy to understand why some people would be like, would argue that, reverse racism is a thing. But in sociology and in activist circles and in anti-racism circles and in intersectional feminist circles, when we use the word racism, this is not what we are implying. When we use the word racism, we are implying that this word has a history, has a background, and also has more of a general and public dimension than just a personal hatred or resentment towards a certain group of people. So oftentimes you will hear that racism is conducted and reinforced by the states, the institutions, and the power in place. So if you take the example of the United States, it's very obvious, it's a very easy example to say that obviously police violence, police brutality, and police attacks target more, black men, for example, or men of color, generally speaking. If you take France as an example, you have difficulties having access to housing if you're a person of color. If your name doesn't sound French, if you have an accent, it's also more difficult for you to get a job depending on your accent, depending on your ethnicity, depending on what you look like. For example, black people who have very, very curly hair, that's sometimes a bit of a struggle for them to be accepted with their natural hair. That's discrimination based on a representation that we have of black people. Police, schooling, housing, job, that's a lot, right? When you look at politics, even though in France as well as in the United States, we have, the population is not only white, right? But in France, if you look closely at the politics, men and women, first of all, where are the women? But then again, after that, where are people of color? Most people are white, so there is a lack of representation in power in politics, which is crucial, which is very, very important. And if you're asking yourself why, well, simply because some studies, some schools, some careers are not accessible for everybody. And you look at some jobs, let's say cleaning jobs, for example, or construction work. In France, at least, and I'm sure it's the same in other countries, you have a majority of people that are people of color. Either people of color that are French or people of color that are migrants, or migrants that are considered white but not quite, if you know what I mean. So when you look at all those things, you start to understand what it means, a racism that's supported by the state. And while, yes, in the textbooks and according to the laws, we're all equal, it's not the reality of things. And I wouldn't assume that people are actually so naive to think that the laws are exactly what you see in your everyday life. Coming to the historical background or heritage, basically racism relies on what is nowadays not very talked about, which is very frowned upon as well. What we call neo-Nazis actually are the ones who keep having those base as their ideology. But what was widely accepted in the 19th century, and which is the base of racism, which is a racist ideology, which at the time was considered a science. People were actually measuring people's heads, people's bodies, they were making sketches of their face, they were assuming the size of their brains, their intellectual capacities. Black people, for example, were presented in circus as those creatures. There are so many different types of hierarchies where obviously whites are always at the top, and then you have brown people, black people, Asian people, etc., etc. This right now, in our day and age, for most people, seem to be absolutely horrific and absolutely horrendous, and we seem to think that it is completely disappeared, but it's not. It's actually not. It's still present in some very subtle and underlying messages and representations that we have of otherness. And it's still something very prevalent in some alt-right groups. There has never been a time in history where there was such a literature of science, of essays and theories and books of all sorts to say that whites were inferior, to say that whites were animals, to say that whites were stupid or dangerous or anything like that. So it is very important to understand that racism holds this very structured, and I would say a theoretical baggage. And therefore, when you say that, hating on a white person and calling them, I don't know, dirty whitey or something along those lines is the same as using the N word, for example. It is not, because there is not all the historical background attached to it. There is not. One thing that people say also very frequently is that, in white countries, historically white countries, like France, for example, it's, there is no reverse racism, but that if you're a white minority abroad, there is going to be reverse racism. Well, quite frankly, I've traveled quite a bit, and while there are countries such as Japan, for example, where you have some prejudices and some very strange and fetishizing and objectifying ideas and representations of white people, such as white women are very sexual, white people smell very strongly, white people are fat, it's not racism. It's not. And while some Japanese may dislike you, and while some, some whatever country may dislike you, when you're white and you're traveling, oftentimes you have a pretty good life, because white is still considered the standard. It's still considered a goal in many societies. It's still considered as a beauty ideal. And you also have, while it's of course very objectifying and very dehumanizing sometimes, there is absolutely no historical background such as the one we have in Europe, for example, towards people of color. There is absolutely no ideology that says that whites are inferior once again. And even that, when you take Japan, for example, as an illustration case, they have a very, very nationalist ideology in Japan, but it's never directed towards white. It's mostly directed towards their neighbors, their Asian neighbors. So it's not true to say that reverse racism is a thing outside of white countries. So next, of course, on my list is South Africa. So South Africa is an example that's oftentimes mentioned, and I can't really understand why people do that, because it's like... In South Africa, about 9% of the population is white. The rest of the population is black. While it's only 9% of the population that's white, they still have most of the privileges. They still have the most well-paid jobs. They earn more. They live in safer and more beautiful and expensive areas. They have access to more culture. And take the example of farmers, which is oftentimes what's mentioned once again. While they are about 8 or 9% of the population, they earn about 70% of the land. Isn't that crazy? Of course, if you're a black person, you're gonna be angry and mad about that. Doesn't it sound logical? I mean, it sounds pretty logical to me. Am I saying that attacking people is okay? That's not what I'm saying. But what I'm saying is, instead of crying racism, look at what's happening before. Look at what's causing this. And once again, when people claim that, whites are being threatened and killed over there, South Africa has a very high rate of criminality. The criminality rate is super high over there. And when you actually look at statistics, the criminality towards white people is actually quite little compared to the vast majority of criminality that's happening and that's targeting other black people. So really not a good example. Coming to France, what we have in France is called dom-tom. It's basically territories that we colonized and we kept as part of France. France outside of like the shape of France that you know. And some people say that white people over there also experience racism. I would say that quite the same logic applies to the one in South Africa. We are not supposed to be there, and we still have so much more than people who are actually from there. So how can you expect those people to not be angry, to not be resentful, to not sometimes just get violent or rude or aggressive? Like, that doesn't really make sense to me. So I really wanted to tackle this subject in English on my channel because I don't think I have, which is one of the rare topics I haven't talked about. So I just wanted it to be really clear. When we say that reverse racism does not exist, we have all of those reasons, which are facts, which are really easily searchable, and you can have access to all of those information. You can access to all of that online. You can read books. It's actually really hard to deny any of that if you're actually willing to open your eyes. So that's what we're saying. That's why we're saying racism doesn't exist. But we do not say that hatred, resentment, aggression, violence towards white people does not exist. That's not what we're saying. But we're saying that racism is not a word that applies in those situations. Also, it doesn't mean that we say that only whites can be racist. Not the case at all. Not the case at all. People of color, once again, why whites are not considered part of people of color, but you know what I mean. People of color can be racist towards each other. If you look at Arabic people and black people, at some points, and in some countries such as Morocco, they're not Arabic, they're from Northern Africa, but like even in Egypt, there are discriminations, there are representations of black people that are not really positive, that are not flattering. They don't have access to the same rights, the same housing, the same education sometimes even. And even in Arabic there is a word that's used to describe black people that's very offensive, So you can be racist if you're a person of color. Your state can be racist even if you're outside of Europe or if you're outside of the United States. For example, take Israel, which is probably the most racist state ever, which basically has in its law, like real laws, that Jewish ethnicity is the most important in Israel. They have most rights. They have more rights than anyone else. And they are always trying to basically destroy any trace of Palestinian history, presence. They are occupying their lands. They're taking their lands away by force. All of those things. Israel is a very, very, very racist state. And yes, it's not Europe. And yes, it's not the US. It's a complex thing. But as it is a complex thing, let's accept that words also hold a very complex meaning, a very complex history, and therefore we should not use them carelessly. That's all I wanted to say. I hope you found this interesting. I'm gonna try and put some links down below. Please feel free to share any information. Please be respectful as well. Just be aware if you're an alt-right person, a racist person, a xenophobic person, your comment's gonna be deleted, and that's just the way it is. I'm not gonna lose my sleep on that. So thank you for watching. I hope you're doing amazingly well, and I'll see you soon. Bye!